It's November. You just turned the heat on for the first time this season. Maybe you complained about your energy bill. Maybe you put on a sweater and made something warm to drink. Maybe you looked out the window at the first frost and felt that particular mix of dread and coziness that only cold weather produces. And then you went about your day, completely insulated from the actual consequences of winter, in a way that would be utterly incomprehensible to almost every human who has ever lived. Because for most of human history, winter wasn't an inconvenience. It was a test. A serious, potentially lethal, months-long test of whether you had done enough, prepared enough, known enough to still be alive when the temperature came back up. And the margin for error was razor thin. So here's the question. How did they do it? Not in the vague sense of they wore furs and huddled together, but specifically, practically, what did early humans actually know and do that got them through seasons that could drop to temperatures we now consider life-threatening emergencies? The answer involves more ingenuity, more planning, and more accumulated knowledge than most people ever imagine. Let's get into it. First, we need to establish something that completely reframes the question. Early humans didn't just survive winter. In many cases, they planned for it months in advance with a level of strategic foresight that would impress a modern logistics manager. The evidence for this comes from multiple directions. Archaeological sites from the Paleolithic, the long period of human prehistory stretching from roughly 3.3 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago, show consistent patterns of seasonal behavior. Groups moved differently in winter than in summer. They chose different locations. They cached food. They modified their shelters. They changed what they hunted and how they hunted it. This is not improvisation. This is planning. And planning requires something that is cognitively sophisticated. The ability to think about a future state that hasn't happened yet, to take actions now whose payoff comes months later. A group that only thought about the present couldn't survive winter in northern climates. Only groups that thought ahead could. Which means winter may have been one of the primary drivers of long-term planning as a cognitive capability in early humans. Researcher Thomas Wynn at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, has argued that the demands of surviving seasonal resource scarcity, including winter, may have been a significant factor in the evolution of human working memory and executive function. Winter didn't just test humans. It may have helped make us smarter. Let's start with fire, because fire is the most obvious winter survival technology. But the story of fire and winter is considerably more interesting than just they made a fire to stay warm. The control of fire by early humans is now established to go back at least 1 million years, and possibly as far as 1.5 to 1.8 million years, based on evidence from sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa and Gesher Benat Yaakov in Israel. But the relationship between fire and winter is not just about warmth. It's about a whole cluster of survival advantages that become especially critical in cold conditions. Fire extends the day. In winter, daylight is shorter. Without fire, when the sun goes down, productivity essentially stops. With fire, early humans could continue processing food, making tools, repairing clothing, and maintaining social bonds well into the night. This extension of productive time may have been as important to winter survival as the warmth itself. Fire dries and preserves. Meat hung near a fire desiccates. Fish smoked over coals resists decomposition. These simple preservation techniques, which don't require any technology beyond fire and time, can extend the viability of food for weeks or months. In winter, when fresh food is scarce, preserved food is the difference between eating and not eating. Fire also changes the immediate microenvironment. A well-placed fire in a cave or rock shelter doesn't just warm the people sitting around it, it raises the temperature of the entire enclosed space, reduces moisture, and creates conditions that are meaningfully survivable even when the temperature outside drops well below freezing. But fire alone isn't enough. You need fuel, and in winter, fuel can be scarce. Dead wood gets buried under snow, gets wet, refuses to burn. This means that fuel gathering and fuel storage was a critical winter survival skill that has left almost no trace in the archaeological record, but was almost certainly practiced extensively. Experimental archaeologist Will Robrooks at Leiden University has documented how maintaining a fire through a northern European winter requires not just occasional fuel gathering but systematic, ongoing effort. A single fire in a cave, maintained continuously, can consume hundreds of kilograms of wood over the course of a winter. Someone has to get that wood. Every day. Even when it's snowing. This single fact transforms how we should picture early human winter life. It wasn't passive huddling around a fire. It was continuous, organized labor to maintain the conditions for survival. And that labor had to be distributed across the group, which required coordination, communication, and something like a division of roles. Now let's talk about shelter, because the image of early humans in caves is real, but it's incomplete in ways that matter enormously. Caves were excellent winter shelters when they were available. They provide natural insulation, protection from wind, and a stable temperature that rarely drops as low as the outside air. But caves are not evenly distributed across the landscape. Many regions of Europe, Asia, and the Americas where early humans lived during cold periods had no accessible caves. And even where caves existed, competition for them was fierce, from bears, from lions, from other groups of humans. So early humans also built. The earliest evidence of constructed shelter dates to at least 400,000 years ago from sites in Europe where post holes and structural debris suggest wooden structures of some kind. By around 40,000 years ago, there is clear evidence of more sophisticated construction. At Mezirik in Ukraine, dating to roughly 15,000 years ago, archaeologists found the remains of 4 large structures built primarily from mammoth bones, hundreds of bones arranged into walls and framework, almost certainly covered with hides. These structures could have housed multiple families and provided meaningful insulation against Ukrainian winter temperatures that regularly dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. What's remarkable about the Mezirik structures is not just that they were built, but that building them required coordinated effort, planning, and accumulated knowledge of construction techniques. Someone knew how to do this, and they taught others. And those others survived winters that would kill an unprepared modern adult in hours. Clothing is the next layer, and it may be the most important one. Because the human body, stripped of clothing, is remarkably poorly adapted to cold. We lost most of our body hair during evolution for thermoregulation in hot African environments. In cold climates, that same hairlessness becomes a serious liability. The evidence for prehistoric clothing is frustratingly indirect because organic materials don't preserve well. But we have several lines of evidence that clothing goes back much further than we once thought. The first is genetic. The evolutionary divergence of body lice from head lice, body lice being parasites that live specifically in clothing, dates to between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago, depending on the study. Since body lice can't exist without clothing to live in, this is effectively a genetic timestamp for when humans started wearing enough clothing for lice to colonize it. The second line of evidence is tool-based. Eyed needles, needles with holes for threading, appear in the archaeological record around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago. An eyed needle is not a general-purpose tool. Its only significant use is sewing. Specifically, sewing fitted, layered garments from animal skins. The appearance of eyed needles is the appearance of tailored clothing technology. This matters enormously. There's a significant difference between wrapping yourself in an unprocessed hide and wearing a fitted garment that covers your extremities, seals out wind, and layers for insulation. Modern cold weather survival experts know that the difference between improvised and tailored cold weather clothing can be the difference between life and death in temperatures below -10 degrees Celsius. Early humans figured this out, probably through hard experience, and developed the technology to address it. Food in winter is where the story gets most strategic, because the fundamental winter problem is this: the animals and plants that provide food in summer are scarce, migrated, dormant, or hidden in winter. What do you eat? The answer early humans developed was not one strategy but several, layered, and adapted to local conditions. Fat was critical. Modern nutrition science knows that fat is the most calorie-dense macronutrient, providing more than twice the calories per gram of protein or carbohydrate. In cold conditions, the body's caloric needs increase significantly. Simply maintaining core body temperature in cold air burns substantial extra calories. Early humans who survived winter did so partly by prioritizing fat consumption in ways that would make a modern nutritionist uncomfortable. Bone marrow, one of the most fat-dense foods available, was extracted and consumed with tools going back at least 2 million years. Brain tissue, organ meats, the fat stores behind the eyes of large animals. These were prized, not incidentally consumed. Megafauna hunting in winter had a specific strategic logic. Large animals like mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and giant deer couldn't hide or migrate easily. They were large enough to provide enormous quantities of fat and protein from a single successful hunt. And in winter, the cold itself provided natural refrigeration. A killed mammoth could be stored in frozen ground and consumed over weeks, rather than spoiling in days the way it would in summer heat. But hunting large, dangerous animals in winter conditions is its own survival challenge. Cold reduces reaction time. Snow obscures tracks and changes the landscape. Fingers numbed by cold fumble with tools. The physics of spear throwing change when your muscles are cold. So early humans developed winter-specific hunting technologies and strategies. Spear throwers, the atlatl, appear in the archaeological record around 30,000 years ago and significantly extend the range at which a hunter can deliver a lethal throw, reducing the need to get dangerously close to large prey. Trapping and snaring, which do not require the hunter to be present and can work continuously while the hunter stays warm, were almost certainly used extensively, even though the traps themselves rarely survive. Researcher John Hoffaker at the University of Colorado has documented evidence that early human groups in northeastern Europe during glacial periods systematically exploited specific animal migration routes in winter, essentially setting up camp at geographic bottlenecks where herds of reindeer or horses had to pass, and hunting intensively during those passages. This isn't opportunistic scavenging. It's strategic positioning based on accumulated knowledge of animal behavior across seasons. There's one more dimension of winter survival that almost never gets discussed, and I think it's the most interesting one: the psychological dimension. Winter is dark. In northern latitudes, winter days can be as short as 5 or 6 hours. Extended darkness affects mood, sleep patterns, energy levels, and cognitive function in ways that modern medicine recognizes as seasonal affective disorder. Early humans would have experienced the same neurological effects without any understanding of what was happening to them or why. And yet they had something we've largely lost: fire and community. Research by anthropologist Polly Wiesner at the University of Utah has documented a striking pattern in modern hunter-gatherer communities. Daytime conversation is dominated by practical matters, food, resources, conflict. But firelit nighttime conversation is dramatically different. It's dominated by stories, by narrative, by the sharing of experience and imagination. Wiesner argues that firelit storytelling was not entertainment added on top of survival. It was a survival mechanism. Stories transmit knowledge across generations. They build social bonds that make cooperation more likely. They provide a framework for understanding the world that reduces anxiety and maintains the sense of shared purpose that keeps groups functioning under stress. In a northern winter, sitting around a fire for 12 or 14 hours a night with your group, telling stories, was not a luxury. It was how you kept the group alive. Psychologically, socially, informationally. The long winter nights that sound like a hardship were also the crucible in which human culture, storytelling, mythology, identity, collective knowledge, was most intensely forged. So here's the complete picture of early human winter survival. It wasn't one thing. It was a system. Fire for warmth and food preservation and extended productive time. Shelter, caves when available, constructed structures when not. Fitted, layered clothing made with sophisticated technology. Strategic food storage and fat prioritization. Intelligent hunting and trapping adapted to winter conditions. And through all of it, the social and psychological glue of a tight community that kept each other warm, not just physically, but in every sense that matters. The person who survived winter wasn't the strongest or the fastest. It was the one embedded in a group that had accumulated the right knowledge, built the right relationships, and maintained the trust and cooperation required to share scarce resources through the hardest months of the year. The next time you turn on your heat in November, or stock your pantry before a storm, or settle in with people you love for a long dark evening, you are doing, in a more comfortable key, something your ancestors were doing with desperate seriousness. The instinct to prepare, to gather, to come inside, to get close to warmth and to each other. These are not modern habits. They are ancient ones, and they are the reason you exist. If this one made your next cold night feel a little different, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one. There's something we haven't talked about yet that deserves its own space: the role of children and the elderly in winter survival. Because in a season where every calorie counted and every able-bodied person's labor was essential, the presence of people who couldn't hunt or gather full loads represented a genuine strategic challenge. And how early humans handled that challenge tells us something important about who they were. The archaeological record contains clear evidence of care for individuals who could not have survived without sustained help from others. A Neanderthal individual known as Shenadar I, found at Shenadar Cave in Iraq, was an older male who had suffered a crushing injury to his skull, damage to his right arm severe enough that it had to be amputated at the elbow, and had arthritis that would have severely limited his mobility. He lived for years after these injuries. He could not have hunted. He could not have gathered effectively. He survived because others fed him, protected him, and kept him warm. In winter, this would have been a deliberate, resource-costly choice. Researcher Eric Trinkhaus at Washington University in St. Louis has documented multiple cases of prehistoric individuals who survived serious injuries or debilitating conditions for extended periods, arguing that this pattern of care is not incidental. It reflects a social value, a willingness to invest in group members beyond their immediate productive utility. In evolutionary terms, this makes sense. The elderly carry knowledge. Children represent the future. Neither is useless. But in winter, keeping them alive requires surplus calories and protected warmth that the group had to deliberately provide. Winter also drove something else that almost never gets discussed in survival terms: art and symbolic thinking. Some of the most extraordinary examples of prehistoric art are found in caves in southern France and northern Spain. Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, and many of these sites were occupied most intensively during winter months, based on analysis of animal bones and hearth ash. Why winter? Part of the answer is practical. Deep caves maintain a stable temperature year-round, making them more comfortable in winter than the exposed landscape outside. But part of the answer may be something else. Long winter nights, by firelight, with nothing to hunt and nowhere to go, may have been when early humans had both the time and the psychological state most conducive to the kind of sustained, contemplative activity that produced extraordinary art. Researcher Ian McGilchrist has written extensively about how the brain processes time differently in states of reduced stimulation, the kind of state produced by long, dark, cold winters when movement is restricted and the primary activity is maintaining warmth and social cohesion. The creative, pattern-finding, meaning-making functions of the brain may actually be enhanced by the enforced stillness of winter. The art in the caves may not be despite the winter. It may partly be because of it. This suggests something moving about the relationship between hardship and human creativity. The same conditions that made winter the most dangerous time of year, the darkness, the cold, the enforced proximity, the long nights with nothing but fire and each other, were also the conditions that produced some of the most remarkable creative output in all of human prehistory. Winter didn't just test us. It may have been one of the seasons when we were most fully, most intensely, most recognizably ourselves. And there is one final piece of winter survival that I want to leave you with, because I think it is the most quietly radical insight in this entire story. Knowledge. Not fire. Not shelter. Not clothing. Knowledge was the most important winter survival technology early humans had, and specifically, the transfer of knowledge between generations. Think about what winter knowledge actually consists of. Which plants store energy underground as roots or tubers and can be dug up even under snow? Which animals follow which routes in which months? Where the south-facing slopes are that accumulate less snow and expose more forage? Which caves stay above freezing? How thick the ice on a river needs to be before it's safe to cross? How to read the sky for incoming storms? How to treat frostbite with the materials available? How to maintain a fire in wet conditions? How to construct a shelter that doesn't collapse under snow load? None of this can be learned in a single winter. Most of it can only be learned across many winters, accumulated gradually through direct experience and, crucially, through being taught by someone who already knows. An elder who had survived 40 winters in a given landscape was carrying knowledge that was literally irreplaceable. Their death in winter, from cold, from a fall on ice, from a wound that became infected, was not just a personal tragedy. It was potentially a catastrophic loss of accumulated winter survival knowledge that the group could not quickly replace. This is why the care for elders that we see in the archaeological record is not just sentimental, it is strategic. Protecting the knowledge keepers through the winter was protecting the group's ability to survive future winters, and passing that knowledge on, deliberately, carefully, through observation and instruction and story, was perhaps the most important thing a winter survivor could do. You carry some of that knowledge still, encoded in instincts and reflexes you didn't choose. The impulse to check supplies before a storm. The satisfaction of a well-stocked pantry. The way cold weather makes you want to be indoors with people you trust. These are not arbitrary cultural preferences. They are the downstream echo of tens of thousands of winters survived across hundreds of thousands of years by people who knew exactly how serious the cold could be and who made sure someone else knew it too.